Well, in front of me, I've got a pile of coil springs, and behind me, I've got a 1972 Jeep Commando that I've just wrapped up the 4-link suspension in the rear, and I need to find what set of coil springs is gonna be just perfect. Let's dive in. For this video, I'm actually gonna be comparing, I think it's 6 or 7 different sets of coil springs. On the table in front of me, I just have 3. I've actually already put a pair in the back of the Commando that I think is gonna work perfect, and I've returned 2 other pair of coil springs that didn't quite sit just right. But don't worry, I took a bunch of measurements, I took videos of all of that, and I am gonna go through what I think is the best coil spring for this application, but also give you plenty of information on how to choose a spring for your custom application. I know coilovers can be a little bit pricier. It's nice, I think they package really well. They're really great. On the other hand, if you can get your hand on the right set of coil springs, oftentimes you might be able to save a few bucks. Packaging might be a little bit more difficult. It might take a little bit more fine tuning, but depending on where you're at and your budget and all of those different things, coil springs might still work out just perfect. And in my case, they saved me a bunch of money. I think I've actually all the coil springs I have left here, I did not pay anything for. So you can get good deals on coil springs if you just know where to look. Today we're going to be comparing mostly JLU coil springs versus a Jeep TJ coil spring. So let's dive in and tell you about all these different springs. The different springs I have here on the table are a Rubicon Express 4.5-inch lift for a TJ, stock JLU springs, 5.5-inch dual rate metal cloak springs. In the back of the Commando right now, I have 4-inch Pro Comp TJ springs, and I returned a 2-inch or 2.5-inch JLU coil spring that was a Terraflex. I'll leave all the part numbers here in a minute and go through all that. And then lastly, it was a Max Speeding Rods. It's like an Amazon brand, I think, of just knockoff Chinese parts for a 2.5-inch lift. And I'll go through all the different links. We're gonna take measurements. I'm gonna show you extended and compressed links of all of these. And then here in a minute, I'm gonna go over there and we are going to test spring rate on at least the stock JLU springs, maybe the Rubicon Express springs, because both of these are what you would call a single rate or like a linear rate. And so what should happen is that when we go over there, as we compress this coil spring, so if we take this coil spring and it's 15 inches with no pressure, every inch we compress should give me a reading on this really nice bathroom scale here. And that should give me a rate on a pounds per inch of what this coil spring is. And then with that, we'll do some math and we'll put together all the rates of all the different coil springs here. That's kind of where we're at right now. Let me break down a little bit more about the different types. As I said, these are a linear rate, a single rate, these are a dual rate, and then you also have a progressive rate coil spring. So what's the big difference? Well, as you can see on something like this, all the coil springs are evenly spaced all the way down, should have a uniform rate from top to bottom. So as it compresses, it's the same rate up to top to bottom. Then if we look at this metal cloak spring, you can see here, the very top, it's really tightly wound, really close together up here, and then further spaced out down here. And so what really happens is that this top portion, once you get weight on it, basically completely compresses to a solid coil. Everything rides here for the main part of the suspension travel. But then when you really go to droop it out, you start getting into this lighter spring. Then lastly, I don't have any here, you have a progressive rate spring, which basically means it might have a little bit more tighter wound, or the coil diameter might be a little bit different as it progresses, and that's gonna give you a different rate as you travel through the motion on the coil spring as well. So what does that mean? Why is one better than the other? I'm not really sure. I would say one is better than the other. I'm sure somebody out there will have better knowledge than me on this, but what I would say is what you really want to try to do is find a coil spring with the right free length and a right rate that's going to get you at the right ride height that you want. Because I don't know if you guys have seen, but I've seen a lot of these videos out there. The guys get flexed out. And basically they have more travel available than their coil spring has in length. That coil spring unloads And then when they get weight back on that tire, everything compresses and that coil spring is not there. So what's really important is that you want to make sure the free length of your coil spring matches with the total travel of your suspension. So when you're drooping out, you want that coil spring to press against the axle, press against up top, and leave pressure pushing that axle into the ground. Because if not, even though the tire might be touching, you're not having anything to actually put any force to the ground. And so that's where it's really important to make sure all those things align. Hopefully that gives you guys a pretty good idea of the different layouts when it comes to single, dual rate, progressive rate coil springs. Now let's go ahead and dive in and let's test this 4.5-inch Rubicon Express spring and the stock JLU spring and see where we're at when it comes to coil rate or spring rate. Here we go, over here. So as you can see, my press is over here in the corner. Not gonna be super great for filming, so what I'm gonna do is get everything set up. I'm gonna grab the camera, show you where we're at, compress it, and show you where it's at again. So here we go, let me get that set up. You can see my super scientific setup here. I have my coil spring set up. I've got my bathroom scale. Everything's good in the press. I've now come over here as well and reset. There you go, if we look straight above, reset it to 0 pounds. And so now, let me go ahead and get you a measurement. Okay, so we zoom in here. Looks like that top of that coil spring sitting right at 15.5. So we're gonna go ahead and lower this top bar down here to 15.5 to get a little bit of pressure. I'm gonna compress it 1 inch. We'll take a reading, 2 inch, take a reading, and then we'll do the same thing with the JLU springs and we'll compare with the known spring rate we have. All right, so now if we look, we've got it right to about 14.5 from that plate. We come over here and look, putting it right at about 200 pounds. So we can then conclude mostly that this is a 200-pound spring. Now this scale only goes to like 3 something, so it's not, in theory we should go to 13.5 and then that should give us a 400-pound piece, but I don't have that capability. All right, guys, 13 3/4 is the extended length of a stock JLU Sport rear coil spring. So you can see it's all set up. I've got it zeroed out on the scale. Let's get it down to 12 3/4 and see what this spring rate is. Okay, now you can see sitting right about perfect at that 12 3/4. We've come down 1 full inch and it's putting us right at that 155, close to 160. So depending on how I'm at with my measuring, pretty close to there. So that should give us a good starting point. Now that we've got a tested spring rate for the JLU, we've got a tested spring rate for the Rubicon Express springs. Hopefully what that'll end up doing is allowing us to take the weight once we have it compressed in the back of here, confirm those spring rates, and then we can do a bunch of math, figure out some things, and get spring rates for all of the other springs I've got. And hopefully that will help you guys when it comes to selecting the perfect coil springs for your custom suspension. So here we go, let's dive into all the numbers. Now that I've tested out the spring rates on 2 different springs, I think we have a rough idea of where we're at on everything. And I have here in front of me a piece of paper that talks about all the different spring rates for the springs I tested, and let's dive into it. Now that I have showed you guys how to test the different spring rates, we're gonna put this to the test. That's a lot of testing. Anyway, we're real scientific around here. But now that I know a couple of spring rates or estimated spring rates, I also ordered 1 set of springs that told me the spring rate for it as well. So we're gonna do some cross-referencing, figure out if everything's accurate. But let's dive into what's really important for you guys, the different spring rates, the free links and the compressed links that I came up with on 7 or 8, let me see, hang on 7 different coil springs. So we're gonna be comparing the Jeep TJ and the Jeep JLU coil springs. The first one was the Metal Cloak 5.5-inch rear dual rate coil spring. It was 20.5 inches extended. And then once I put the weight of the Crusty Commando on it, it compressed all the way to 14 inches, which gave me a spring rate of 140 pounds. The next one was the Rubicon Express 4.5-inch rear coil spring. That's a single rate. That was the one that we tested. I do think this is where there was some deviation on the quality of bathroom scale I used and my testing methods. It seemed to not really be happy over 200 pounds because with it, the extended length was 15.5 inches, and then the ride height it sat right at 12 inches. So it's only 3.5 inches of compression, and that would put our calculated spring rate at closer to 260 pounds versus what I think it was like 200 pounds on the bathroom scale. The next spring we went with was Pro Comp 4-inch lift rear spring. And this is where the spring rate part is really interesting. And you know, what I mentioned in the beginning, you really want to find a spring rate and a spring length that's going to make sure it has pressure through the full length of travel at full droop so that you're not unloading that coil spring at full droop. So the Pro Comp 4-inch spring was 16 inches long, so only half an inch longer than the Rubicon Express spring, but actually compressed all the way to 11 inches. So what does that mean? That means the calculated spring rate for it was actually 190 pounds. Then the one that I knew the spring rate for, because it told me when I ordered it, was the Max Speeding Rod 2.5-inch rear lift spring for a TJ. With it, it was 15.5 roughly inches fully extended. And then at ride height, it went all the way to 8 3/4. So I mean, this one really compressed quite a bit. And so with that spring rate on it, only 140 pounds. So you're looking for a lower ride height, but you really want to maximize the amount of down travel, the amount of droop you have without unloading that coil spring. Something like this, you can see you would sit a lot lower, but you're still gonna have that same full length at extension. That's all of the Jeep TJ springs we tested. Let's move on to the JLU springs, because I think this is gonna be really interesting, especially for maybe you TJ guys that are looking for an affordable lift. The first one we tested was the JLU Sport Stock rear springs. So with those were 13.5 inches fully extended, and they compressed all the way down to 8 inches. That made them right at about 165 pound spring rate. And if you remember, we were right at about 160 when we tested on the bathroom scale. So really close to in there. Hopefully between testing that, using the known spring rate that was given to us, we're looking pretty good on figuring out what these different spring rates were. Now, the reason I have 7 springs is I also ordered a 2-inch lift for a JLU. And what was interesting with these, I'll leave the part numbers down below too, it was a TerraFlex 2.5-inch lift. And so apparently on these specific lift springs, they're side specific. One is lower on the spring rate than the other, so they actually sit a little bit different. And so the TerraFlex 2414 rear, that had us at about 18.5 inches extended. So this is one of the longest ones that we tested. But then at ride height, it put me at 10 inches compressed. So I mean, that thing compressed 8.5 inches just sitting at ride height. So put the spring rate on that side at 110 pounds. So that one, I really liked it. I thought it was really good. I thought it was gonna get me really close to where I wanted to be as far as ride height on the Commando. But the problem was then I would have to order a second spring to get me to that same ride height. But then on the other side, the 2564 rear spring by TerraFlex, it's also a 2.5-inch lift, but it put us at extended 18 inches with a ride height of 11 inches. So that put the spring rate actually at 150 pounds. So there you go, that's all the springs I tested. Hopefully that'll help you guys that are looking for a specific coil spring for a custom application without having to order a bunch of different coil springs to get your ride height just about dialed in. I also, in this whole process, found this chart. I'll leave it right here. And it shows roughly what the compressed lengths. So this chart shows what a Jeep TJ estimated lengths are gonna be when they're compressed. Hopefully that will be helpful for you guys too. It seemed fairly accurate with the testing I did on the Crusty Commando. And so, you know, again, I know this can be a little bit tricky. Using coil springs instead of coilovers is one way to save some money when it comes to custom suspension. However, this part of it makes it really complicated to get your ride height dialed in. And so hopefully this information helped you guys out when it came to finding the right coil springs for your ride. Now, what did I end up doing? I ended up going with the Pro Comp 4-inch spring, that 190 pound spring rate. I think it leveled out the ride really nicely. I'm about half an inch higher in the back than the front. I think that works out nice. I'm a little bit higher than I was on loose springs actually, but the ride is amazing. And through this, I also adjusted all of the shocks. So now I have about 6 inches of up travel and 6 inches of down travel on the shock body itself. I'm sure at the tire it's gonna be a little bit more. And I'm really happy with the way this all has turned out. So last thing, guys, after this video, I'm gonna be working on putting together the 4-link video on how I did it, the design, you know, showing you where everything went. If there are specific questions you guys have on my 4-link design on the Crusty Commando, or things you're to highlight or address or talk about, please leave some comments below because that video will be coming out really soon. Hopefully this was helpful. Please stick around, like, subscribe, do all the fun stuff. Till next time, thanks for watching.
Money worm.